Tommy Tuberville hears a soldier crying. What he did next shocked the entire country. The late October evening in Washington, D.C. carried the crisp bite of autumn with amber leaves swirling down Constitution Avenue as Senator Tommy Tuberville made his way through the dimly lit corridors of the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on the sterile walls, creating an atmosphere that felt both clinical and oddly comforting. Tommy had come here not for any official Senate business, but for something far more personal. A promise he'd made to visit wounded veterans during his campaign, a commitment he'd taken seriously since taking office. His footsteps echoed softly against the polished linoleum floors as he navigated the maze-like hallways of the medical facility. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the faint aroma of cafeteria food created an unmistakable hospital atmosphere that brought back memories of his own father's final days in a VA hospital years ago. That experience had shaped his understanding of what military families endured, and it drove his dedication to veterans' issues in the Senate. Tommy paused at the nurse's station, where a tired-looking woman in scrubs looked up from her computer screen. Her name tag read Janet Morrison, RN, and her eyes held the weary compassion of someone who had seen too much suffering but refused to let it harden her heart. "Senator Tuberville," she said, rising from her chair with a mixture of surprise and respect. "We weren't expecting you tonight. Are you here for the ceremony tomorrow?" "No ceremony, Janet," Tommy replied, his Alabama drawl softening his words. "Just keeping a promise I made to myself." "How are our boys and girls doing tonight?" Janet's expression grew more serious as she glanced down the hallway. "We have several new arrivals from overseas. Some are struggling more than others. There's one young man, Sergeant Marcus Johnson, who came in 3 days ago. He's been having a particularly difficult time adjusting." Tommy nodded thoughtfully. In his years as a football coach, he'd learned to read between the lines when people talked about players who were struggling or having difficulty adjusting. It usually meant something deeper was going on, something that required more than just physical healing. "Room number?" he asked. 317, but Senator, he's been pretty resistant to visitors. The chaplain tried earlier, and even his own family." Janet's voice trailed off, but her meaning was clear. "Sometimes the hardest cases need the most patience," Tommy said, remembering countless conversations with troubled players over the years. "Mind if I just walk by? Won't disturb him if he doesn't want company." Janet hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "3rd floor. Turn left at the elevator. But please, if he seems agitated." "I understand," Tommy assured her, already heading toward the elevator bank. The ride to the 3rd floor felt longer than usual, giving Tommy time to reflect on why he was really here. Sure, visiting wounded veterans was good politics, but that wasn't what drove him on these late-night visits. It was something deeper, a recognition that behind every uniform was a young person who had sacrificed more than most Americans could imagine. As a former coach, he'd always believed that leadership meant showing up, especially when it was difficult or inconvenient. The 3rd floor was quieter than the ground level, with most patients presumably asleep. Soft classical music played from hidden speakers, and the lighting had been dimmed to promote rest. Tommy walked slowly down the corridor, reading the nameplates beside each door. Room 315, 316. And then he reached 3-17. The door was slightly ajar, and as Tommy approached, he heard something that made him stop in his tracks. It was a sound he'd heard before, during his coaching days, the quiet, desperate crying of someone trying not to be heard. It was the sound of a young man completely overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control, trying to maintain his dignity while falling apart inside. Tommy paused outside the door, his hand raised to knock, when he heard a voice from within, young, broken, filled with anguish. "Why did I make it out when they didn't?" the voice whispered into the darkness. "Rodriguez had 3 kids. Martinez was getting married next month. Why am I here when they're not coming home? The words hit Tommy like a physical blow. Survivor's guilt, he'd seen it in players who'd been in car accidents where teammates were injured, in coaches who'd made split-second decisions that affected young men's lives. But this was different. This was life and death, and the weight of it was crushing this young soldier. Tommy stood there for a long moment, listening to the quiet sobs coming from room 317. Every instinct told him to knock, to offer comfort, to try to help. But his experience had also taught him that sometimes people needed to be heard before they could be helped. Sometimes the most important thing was simply bearing witness to someone's pain. He settled himself against the wall opposite the door, far enough away not to intrude, but close enough to listen. In the dim hallway light, Tommy closed his eyes and let the weight of this young man's grief wash over him. He thought about all the letters he'd signed, all the condolence calls he'd made, all the flag presentations he'd attended. But this was different. This was raw, unfiltered human suffering, and it demanded more than political platitudes or patriotic speeches. God, the voice continued from within the room. I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see that explosion. I see Rodriguez trying to get to cover. I see Martinez calling for his mom. How do I live with this? How do I go home and pretend everything's okay when half my unit isn't coming back? Tommy felt tears welling up in his own eyes. In all his years of coaching, all his time in politics, he'd never heard such raw honesty about the cost of service. This wasn't the sanitized version of military service that politicians talked about on the campaign trail. This was the reality that families lived with, that young men and women carried long after their service ended. He thought about his own son, about the young men he'd coached over the years, about the privileged life he'd led compared to this soldier. Here was someone who had given everything for his country and was tormented by the fact that he'd survived when others hadn't. The unfairness of it, the cruel randomness of war, was something Tommy had never fully grasped until this moment. The crying continued, softer now, but no less heartbreaking. Tommy realized that he was witnessing something sacred, the pure grief of a warrior mourning his fallen brothers. It wasn't his place to interrupt or try to fix this moment. It was his responsibility to bear witness, to understand what sacrifice really meant. As he stood there in the hallway, Tommy made a decision that would change both his life and the life of the young man crying in room 317. He wouldn't just visit and leave. He wouldn't just offer empty words of gratitude for service. He would find a way to truly help, to honor not just this soldier's sacrifice, but the memory of those who didn't make it home. The hospital clock chimed midnight, and Tommy realized he'd been standing in that hallway for over an hour, listening to Marcus Johnson's grief. But he also realized that this was exactly where he needed to be, for as long as it took. The morning sun filtered through the hospital windows as Tommy returned to Walter Reed, having spent a sleepless night thinking about what he'd heard in the hallway. He carried with him a simple breakfast, black coffee and chocolate chip muffins from a local bakery, the same combination he used to bring to players who were struggling during his coaching days. Sometimes, he'd learned, the smallest gestures opened the biggest doors. Nurse Janet looked surprised to see him again so early. "Senator, you're back already. I thought you might wait a few days." "Couldn't stay away," Tommy admitted, holding up the bag of muffins. "Mind if I try a different approach today?" Janet studied his face and seemed to see something there that reassured her. "Room 317 is awake. He didn't sleep much last night, from what the night shift reported. But Senator, he's angry this morning. Sometimes that's how grief shows up." Tommy nodded. "Anger I can work with. It's the silence that worries me." He made his way to the third floor, his steps more purposeful than the night before. Outside room 317, he could hear movement, The rustle of sheets, the clink of medical equipment, the restless energy of someone trapped in their own thoughts. Taking a deep breath, Tommy knocked gently on the doorframe. "Sergeant Johnson, my name is Tommy Tuberville. I'm a senator from Alabama, but more importantly, I'm someone who'd like to listen if you're willing to talk." Silence. Tommy waited a moment, then continued, "I've got coffee and muffins out here. Nothing fancy, just thought you might be hungry. I'm going to sit in this chair outside your door for a while, whether you want to talk or not. Sometimes it helps just knowing someone's there." He settled into the plastic chair in the hallway, opened his own coffee, and began what would become a daily ritual. For the first hour, there was only silence from room 317. Tommy used the time to read through some of the letters his office had received from military families, keeping his voice low as he occasionally commented on their contents. "Here's one from a Gold Star mother in Mobile," he said, not addressing anyone in particular. "Her son was killed in Afghanistan 2 years ago. She says the hardest part isn't the grief, it's the way people don't know what to say, so they just avoid her. Makes her feel like her son's sacrifice doesn't matter anymore." Tommy heard movement from inside the room, but continued reading. "She's started a support group for other military families, says it helps to talk to people who understand, people who know that 'thank you for your service' doesn't always heal the wounds." After another 30 minutes, Tommy heard a voice from inside the room, hoarse, cautious, but finally speaking. "You really a senator?" "I am," Tommy replied, not moving from his chair. "But before that, I was a football coach for 40 years. Spent a lot of time talking to young men about life, about purpose, about how to keep going when everything falls apart. Football's not war." "No, it's not," Tommy agreed immediately. "Not even close. But loss is loss, and guilt is guilt, and sometimes the principles are the same even when the stakes are completely different." There was a long pause, and then, "What do you want?" Tommy set down his coffee and considered the question carefully. "Honestly, I heard you crying last night. I was walking by your room, and I heard you talking about Rodriguez and Martinez, about why you made it out when they didn't, and I realized that in all my years of politics, all my speeches about supporting the troops, I'd never really listened to what that support actually needs to look like. So this is about your conscience." The anger in the voice was sharp, but Tommy had heard that tone before, from players who felt abandoned, from young men who'd been let down by the adults who claimed to care about them. It wasn't really anger at him. It was anger at a world that felt fundamentally unfair. "Maybe partly," Tommy admitted. "But mostly it's about the fact that you shouldn't have to carry this alone. And from what I heard last night, you've been doing exactly that." Another long silence, and then the sound of footsteps. A young black man appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on a walker. He was thin, with close-cropped hair and eyes that looked decades older than his face. His left leg was heavily bandaged, and Tommy could see the edge of other injuries beneath his hospital gown. This was Sergeant Marcus Johnson, and despite his physical weakness, there was an intensity about him that reminded Tommy of some of his most determined players. "Marcus Johnson," the young man said, extending his hand. "Tommy Tuberville," he replied, standing to shake it. "Mind if we sit? I brought enough coffee for 2. Marcus hesitated, then maneuvered his walker back into the room. Tommy followed, taking in the sparse military precision of the space. Bed made despite Marcus's injuries, few personal items, get-well cards arranged in neat rows on the windowsill. "Those from family?" Tommy asked, nodding toward the cards. "Some. Others from people I don't know." "Thank you for your service cards." Marcus's voice carried a bitter edge. "Like that somehow makes up for Rodriguez's kids growing up without a father." Tommy poured coffee into a second cup and handed it to Marcus, along with a muffin. "Tell me about Rodriguez." The question seemed to surprise Marcus. Most people, he explained, wanted to know about his own injuries, his own recovery. They didn't ask about the men who didn't make it home. Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez, Marcus began slowly. From El Paso, 3 daughters, 8, 6, and 4 years old. He carried pictures of them everywhere, taught me how to play guitar during downtime, said music was the only thing that made sense when everything else was chaos. Tommy listened without interrupting as Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger as he talked about his fallen friend. He was supposed to rotate home in 6 weeks. Had it all planned out? Wanted to coach his oldest daughter's soccer team, take his wife on a second honeymoon to Mexico? Always talked about the future, you know. Always had something to look forward to. And Martinez. Marcus's eyes filled with tears, but he continued. Corporal Diego Martinez, 23 years old, from Phoenix, engaged to his high school sweetheart Rosa. The explosion happened 4 days before he was supposed to leave for his bachelor party. 4 days. Tommy felt the weight of these stories, the specific details that made these men real rather than statistics. How did it happen? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the Washington, D.C. skyline. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Roadside bomb. We were on patrol in a village outside Kabul. Intelligence said it was clear, but intelligence is wrong sometimes. I was point man, which means I should have been the one who triggered it. Should have been me who didn't make it home. But it wasn't. But it wasn't, Marcus repeated, his voice breaking. The blast threw me clear, knocked me unconscious, messed up my leg, gave me a concussion. When I came to, Rodriguez was trying to crawl to Martinez. Both of them were calling for help, and I couldn't move. I couldn't help them. Tommy set down his coffee and leaned forward. Marcus, what happened to Rodriguez and Martinez? That's not your fault. Isn't it? Marcus's voice rose, anger flashing in his eyes. I was point man. My job was to spot threats, keep the unit safe. If I'd been better, if I'd seen something. If you'd been better, you'd be dead too, Tommy said firmly. And Rodriguez's daughters would have lost you as well as their father. Martinez's fiancée would be mourning 2 men instead of 1. Sometimes survival isn't about being better or worse. Sometimes it's just about chance and what you do with the chance you've been given. Marcus stared at him, tears streaming down his face. What am I supposed to do with it? How do I live a life that they'll never get to have? It was the question that had kept Tommy awake all night, and he realized that his answer would determine whether this conversation led somewhere meaningful or just added to Marcus's pain. You live it in a way that honors their memory, Tommy said slowly, not by feeling guilty for surviving, but by making sure their sacrifice means something. By making sure people remember Carlos Rodriguez and Diego Martinez as more than just names on a memorial wall. Marcus was quiet for a long time, processing Tommy's words. Finally he asked, "How do I do that?" "I don't know yet," Tommy admitted, "but I'd like to help you figure it out, if you're willing." For the first time since Tommy had arrived, Marcus almost smiled. "You really would do that? Help some random soldier you don't even know?" "Marcus," Tommy said, standing to leave, "after what I heard last night, after talking to you today, you're not random to me anymore. You're someone who lost his brothers and is trying to figure out how to keep going, and that's exactly the kind of problem I want to spend my time solving." As Tommy gathered his things to leave, Marcus called out to him, "Senator, will you come back tomorrow?" "I'll be here," Tommy promised. "Same time, same coffee, and maybe by then we'll start figuring out what comes next." 3 weeks had passed since Tommy's first conversation with Marcus, and their daily meetings had become a fixture at Walter Reed. What started as coffee and muffins had evolved into something neither man had expected, a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Marcus was walking better now, his physical therapy showing results, but the emotional healing was proving more complex. On this particular morning, Tommy arrived to find Marcus dressed in civilian clothes for the first time, sitting in the chair where Tommy usually sat, The young sergeant had been discharged from the hospital ward, but was staying in transitional housing on the base while completing his recovery. "You're looking stronger," Tommy observed, settling into the chair Marcus had vacated. "Feeling stronger too," Marcus replied, though his eyes still carried the weight of his grief. "The nightmares are getting less frequent. The guilt, well, that's a work in progress." Tommy had learned that healing wasn't linear. Some days, Marcus was filled with determination to honor his fallen brothers. Other days, the weight of survival threatened to crush him completely. But gradually, consistently, he was making progress. "I've been thinking about what you said," Marcus continued, "about making their sacrifice mean something, about making sure people remember Rodriguez and Martinez as real people, not just names." And Marcus pulled out a notebook, the same one Tommy had brought him a week earlier, thinking that writing might help process his thoughts. The pages were now filled with Marcus's careful handwriting. "I want to do something bigger than just talking about them in interviews or writing letters to their families. Those things matter. But," Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully, "I want to create something that lasts. Something that helps other people going through what I'm going through." Tommy leaned forward, interested. "What did you have in mind?" "A foundation," Marcus said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "The Rodriguez-Martinez Foundation for Military Family Support. Not just financial help, though that would be part of it. I'm talking about real support, grief counseling, survivor guilt treatment, help for families adjusting to loss, resources for soldiers dealing with what I'm dealing with." The idea was ambitious, and Tommy could see that Marcus had put serious thought into it. He'd filled pages with research on existing veterans organizations, gaps in current services, and specific programs that could make a difference. "This is impressive work, Marcus, but starting a foundation, that's a massive undertaking. Have you thought about the logistics, the funding, the legal requirements?" "That's where I was hoping you might be able to help," Marcus said, meeting Tommy's eyes directly. "I know I can't do this alone. I need someone who understands how to navigate bureaucracy, how to raise money, how to get things done in Washington. Someone who believes in the mission." Tommy was quiet for a moment, considering the magnitude of what Marcus was proposing. Starting a foundation was complicated under the best circumstances. Doing it while still recovering from combat trauma, while still processing grief and survivor guilt, that was something else entirely. "Marcus, I want to help you, you know that. But I have to ask, are you sure you're ready for something this big? Recovery is hard work, and starting a foundation is hard work. Doing both at the same time." "Senator," Marcus interrupted, his voice firm, "this is my recovery. Sitting around feeling sorry for myself, waiting for the guilt to magically disappear. That's not helping anyone. Rodriguez and Martinez are gone, and nothing I do will bring them back. But maybe I can keep other families from going through what theirs are going through. Maybe I can help other soldiers who are lying in hospital beds at 3 in the morning, wondering why they survived when their brothers didn't." The passion in Marcus's voice reminded Tommy of his most dedicated players, young men who had transformed personal pain into purposeful action. He recognized the determination, the way Marcus had channeled his grief into something constructive. "All right," Tommy said, making a decision that would change both their lives. "Let's do this, but we do it right. Professional legal help, proper business planning, sustainable funding strategies. If we're going to honor Rodriguez and Martinez's memory, we do it with excellence." Marcus's face lit up with the first genuine smile Tommy had seen from him. "You really mean it? You'll help me build this?" "I mean it. But Marcus, I need you to understand what you're committing to. This foundation, if we do it right, it's going to become your life's work. It's going to mean public speaking, fundraising events, media interviews. People are going to want to hear your story over and over again. Are you prepared for that?" Marcus nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that too. At first, the idea terrified me. But then I realized, if telling my story helps one soldier get through the worst night of his life, if it helps one family understand they're not alone in their grief, then it's worth it. Rodriguez and Martinez gave their lives for something they believed in. The least I can do is give my comfort for something I believe in. Tommy felt a surge of pride and admiration for this young man who had transformed his pain into purpose. Okay then, let's start with the basics. We'll need to incorporate as a 501c3, which means lawyers and paperwork. We'll need a board of directors, people with experience in military affairs, mental health, and non-profit management. We'll need a business plan that shows exactly how we'll achieve our mission. I've already started thinking about the board, Marcus said, flipping through his notebook. I'd like to ask Rodriguez's widow, Maria, if she'd be willing to serve. She's a social worker and she understands what military families go through. And Martinez's fiancée, Rosa, she's studying psychology, focused on trauma counseling. If they're willing, their perspective would be invaluable. Tommy was impressed by Marcus's thoughtfulness. Including the families of fallen soldiers wasn't just symbolic, it was strategically smart. Their voices would carry weight that no politician or military leader could match. That's excellent thinking. What about funding? Starting a foundation is expensive, and running programs costs money. Marcus's expression grew more serious. I've been researching that too. There are grants available for veteran-focused nonprofits, but the competition is fierce. I was thinking we might start with smaller fundraising events, maybe something tied to the anniversary of Rodriguez and Martinez's deaths. Turn that day from just a day of mourning into a day of action. That's powerful, Tommy agreed, but we'll also need major donors, people with deep pockets who believe in the mission. Corporate sponsors, maybe some celebrities with military connections. Building that network takes time. I know, Marcus said. That's why I need someone like you involved. You have connections I don't have. You understand how to work with people in power. But Senator, I need you to know, this isn't about using your political influence to build my career or make me famous. This is about creating something that will help people long after both of us are gone. Tommy studied Marcus's face and saw the sincerity there. This wasn't about personal ambition or political gain. This was about taking the worst experience of a young man's life and transforming it into something that could prevent others from suffering the same way. Marcus, I believe you, and I believe in this mission. But I want you to think about something else too. Starting this foundation, it's going to change how people see you. Right now, you're a wounded veteran recovering from trauma. Once we announce this, you become a public figure, a spokesman for military families. That comes with scrutiny, with pressure, with expectations. Are you ready for that? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the late morning traffic on Wisconsin Avenue. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and determined. Senator, 3 weeks ago, I was lying in that hospital bed wishing I had died instead of Rodriguez and Martinez. Today, I'm sitting here planning a foundation that could help thousands of people. If that's not proof that I'm ready to be more than just a victim of circumstances, I don't know what is. Tommy extended his hand across the small table between them. Partners. Marcus shook it firmly. Partners. For Rodriguez, for Martinez, and for every soldier who comes after us. As they sat there shaking hands, neither man fully understood the magnitude of what they were beginning. Within months, their partnership would capture national attention, draw support from unexpected quarters, and create something that would outlast both of their careers. But in that moment, all they knew was that they had found a way to transform grief into hope, loss into purpose, and individual pain into collective healing. 6 months after their first meeting, Tommy and Marcus stood backstage at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., preparing for the event that would launch the Rodriguez-Martinez Foundation into the national spotlight. The press conference had been planned for weeks, but Marcus still felt his hands trembling as he adjusted his tie for the third time. "You ready for this?" Tommy asked, placing a steadying hand on Marcus's shoulder. "As ready as I'll ever be," Marcus replied, though his voice betrayed his nervousness. "I keep thinking about what Rodriguez would say if he could see me now. Probably something like, 'Johnson, stop overthinking and just tell the truth.'" The foundation had come together faster than either of them had expected. Maria Rodriguez, Carlos's widow, had agreed to serve on the board of directors, bringing her social work expertise and the credibility that only a Gold Star family member could provide. Rosa Martinez, Diego's former fiancée, had also joined, despite the pain of revisiting her loss. Their involvement had been crucial in developing the foundation's core programs. The legal work had been completed by a prestigious DC law firm that had agreed to handle the incorporation pro bono after Tommy made some calls. The initial funding had come from an unexpected source: a tech billionaire whose own son had served in Afghanistan and who had been moved by Marcus's story when Tommy shared it during a private dinner. But today would be different. Today, Marcus would tell his story to the national media, and the foundation would officially launch with an ambitious goal: raising $10 million in its first year to fund comprehensive support programs for military families dealing with loss and trauma. Through the curtain, Marcus could see the assembled crowd: reporters from major networks, representatives from veterans organizations, members of Congress, and in the front row, Maria Rodriguez and Rosa Martinez, both dressed in black but carrying photographs of their lost loved ones. "Ladies and gentlemen," the moderator announced, "please welcome Senator Tommy Tuberville of Alabama and Sergeant Marcus Johnson, co-founders of the Rodriguez-Martinez Foundation." They walked onto the stage together, Tommy's political experience evident in his confident stride, Marcus moving more cautiously but with growing determination. The room fell silent as they took their seats at the podium table. Tommy spoke first, providing the political context and explaining his role in the foundation. He talked about his commitment to veterans issues, his friendship with Marcus, and his belief that the foundation represented a new model for supporting military families. "But this isn't my story to tell," Tommy concluded, turning to Marcus. "This is the story of a young man who survived something unimaginable and chose to transform his pain into purpose. This is the story of Sergeant Marcus Johnson, and more importantly, it's the story of Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez and Corporal Diego Martinez, whose sacrifice made this foundation necessary and whose memory makes it possible." Marcus stepped to the microphone, and the room seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, he stood there silently, looking out at the sea of faces, cameras, and recording equipment. Then he began to speak, his voice quiet but clear. "7 months ago, I was lying in a hospital bed at Walter Reed, wishing I had died instead of my brothers. Carlos Rodriguez and Diego Martinez didn't make it home from our last patrol in Afghanistan, and I couldn't understand why I did. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't see any reason to keep going." The room remained completely silent as Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. "Senator Tuberville found me at my lowest point. Not because he was looking for a photo opportunity or a political story, but because he heard me crying and decided that someone needed to listen. Over the following weeks, he helped me understand something that I want every grieving military family to hear. Survival is not something to feel guilty about, it's something to feel responsible for." Marcus paused, looking directly at Maria Rodriguez and Rosa Martinez in the front row. Both women were crying, but they nodded encouragingly. "The Rodriguez-Martinez Foundation exists because Carlos and Diego can't be here to help the families who are going through what theirs went through. It exists because there are soldiers right now, lying in hospital beds, wondering why they survived when their friends didn't. It exists because grief is not something you get over. It's something you learn to carry, and no one should have to learn that alone. A reporter raised her hand and Marcus nodded for her question. Sergeant Johnson, can you tell us specifically what programs the Foundation will offer? Marcus looked at Tommy, who nodded encouragingly, then turned back to the microphone. We're launching with 3 core programs. First, immediate crisis support for military families dealing with sudden loss, counselors who understand military culture, financial assistance for families dealing with funeral expenses and transition costs, and practical help with things like housing and childcare while families grieve. Second, long-term counseling and support groups specifically for survivor guilt and combat trauma. Not just for the soldiers who come home, but for their families too. When someone survives something their brothers didn't, the whole family carries that weight. Third, and maybe most importantly, memorial programs that ensure fallen soldiers are remembered as complete human beings, not just names on walls. We want to fund scholarships in their honor, community service projects in their memory, and storytelling programs that capture who they were before they became statistics. Another reporter stood up. This is a very personal mission for you, Sergeant. How do you respond to critics who might say you're exploiting your trauma for fundraising purposes? The question was harsh, but Marcus had prepared for it. Tommy started to lean toward the microphone, but Marcus gently touched his arm, indicating he wanted to answer himself. Anyone who thinks I'm doing this for money or attention has never spent 3 in the morning wondering why their friends are dead and they're not, Marcus said, his voice firm but not angry. I'm doing this because Rodriguez's 8-year-old daughter shouldn't have to grow up thinking her father died for nothing. I'm doing this because Martinez's fiancée shouldn't have to face her grief alone. And I'm doing this because there's a soldier somewhere right now who's about to give up hope, and maybe our foundation can reach him before he does. The room erupted in applause, and Marcus felt some of his nervousness fade. This was why he was here. Not for the reporters or the cameras, but for the people who needed to know they weren't alone. Tommy leaned toward the microphone. I'd like to add something to what Sergeant Johnson said. In my 40 years of coaching, I learned that leadership isn't about taking credit when things go well. It's about taking responsibility when things go wrong, and then figuring out how to make them better. Marcus Johnson is the best kind of leader, someone who turned his worst experience into his greatest contribution. After the formal presentation, Marcus and Tommy moved to a reception area where they could speak individually with donors, family members, and veterans advocates. The response was overwhelming. By the end of the afternoon, they had received commitments for over $2 million in initial funding. But for Marcus, the most meaningful moment came when a young soldier approached him, still in uniform, with tears in his eyes. Sergeant Johnson, the soldier said, I lost my squad leader in Iraq 2 years ago. I've been struggling. But hearing you talk today, knowing that someone else understands what this feels like, it's the first time in months that I've felt like maybe I can get through this. Marcus embraced the young soldier, remembering his own darkest moments and realizing that this was exactly why the foundation existed. You can get through this, he said quietly, and now you don't have to do it alone. As the evening wound down, Tommy and Marcus found themselves alone in the empty press room, both exhausted but exhilarated by the day's success. How do you feel? Tommy asked. Marcus looked around the room where, just hours earlier, he had shared his most painful memories with the national media. I feel like Rodriguez and Martinez would be proud, he said. And for the first time since the explosion, I feel like I understand why I survived. Not just to carry their memory, but to make sure their sacrifice helps other people heal. Tommy smiled, recognizing the transformation that had taken place over the past 6 months. The broken young man he'd found crying in a hospital hallway had become a confident advocate for military families, someone who could turn his pain into a force for healing others. Marcus, Tommy said, I think this is just the beginning. 1 year later, Tommy stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, watching as President Biden presented Marcus Johnson with the Presidential Citizens Medal, the nation's second highest civilian honor. The Rodriguez Martinez Foundation had not only met its ambitious fundraising goals, it had exceeded them, raising over $15 million and establishing programs in 12 states. But the numbers, impressive as they were, didn't tell the real story. The real story was in the faces of the people gathered for the ceremony. Maria Rodriguez, whose grief counseling program had helped over 300 military widows. Rosa Martinez, who had completed her psychology degree and now ran the foundation's trauma counseling services. And dozens of veterans and family members whose lives had been transformed by the foundation's work. Marcus, now confident and poised in a way that would have been unimaginable during those early days at Walter Reed, approached the podium to speak. His presence commanded attention not through political authority like Tommy's, but through the authenticity of someone who had survived the worst and chosen to build something beautiful from the wreckage. Mr. President, distinguished guests, brothers and sisters in service, Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly across the garden. A year and a half ago, I was a broken soldier who couldn't understand why I had survived when better men didn't. Today, I stand here representing a foundation that has helped over 2,000 military families find hope in their darkest moments. He paused, looking directly at Tommy, who stood with the other honored guests. But this medal doesn't belong to me alone. It belongs to Senator Tommy Tuberville, who heard a soldier crying and chose to listen instead of walking away. It belongs to Maria Rodriguez and Rosa Martinez, who transformed their grief into a mission to help others. And most of all, it belongs to Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez and Corporal Diego Martinez, whose sacrifice made all of this possible. The audience erupted in sustained applause, but Marcus wasn't finished. When I was lying in that hospital bed, consumed by survivor's guilt, I thought my survival was meaningless. I thought it was unfair that I was alive when my brothers weren't. But Senator Tuberville helped me understand something that I want every veteran, every military family member, every person struggling with loss to understand. We don't honor the dead by destroying ourselves with guilt. We honor them by living lives worthy of their sacrifice. Tommy felt tears in his eyes as he listened to Marcus speak. The transformation had been remarkable, but it hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks, nights when the nightmares returned, days when the weight of public attention felt overwhelming, moments when Marcus questioned whether he was strong enough to carry the responsibility he'd taken on. But there had also been victories that neither of them could have imagined. The Foundation's crisis intervention program had prevented 17 veteran suicides in its first year. Their family support services had helped military widows and widowers navigate the complex process of rebuilding their lives. Their memorial programs had ensured that fallen soldiers were remembered not just as casualties of war, but as fathers, sons, dreamers, and heroes. The Rodriguez Martinez Foundation has grown beyond anything Senator Tuberville and I could have envisioned, Marcus continued. We now operate programs in 12 states, with plans to expand to 25 states by next year. We've partnered with the Department of Veterans Affairs to integrate our services into existing support systems. We've trained over 500 counselors in military-specific trauma treatment. He looked out at the audience, his gaze settling on a section where several veterans and military family members were seated. But our real success isn't measured in dollars raised or programs launched. It's measured in lives saved, families healed, and hope restored. It's measured in the young soldier who called our crisis hotline at 3 a.m. and chose to live instead of giving up. It's measured in the military widow who found the courage to start dating again after 2 years of grief. It's measured in the veteran who learned to sleep through the night without nightmares. As Marcus spoke, Tommy reflected on how their partnership had evolved. What had begun as a simple act of compassion, stopping to listen to a crying soldier, had become one of the most meaningful relationships of his life. Marcus had become like a son to him, and together they had created something that would outlast both of their careers. The foundation's success had also changed Tommy's approach to politics. He was still a conservative Republican, still committed to his core principles, but his work with Marcus had given him a deeper understanding of what military families actually needed. He'd become a more effective advocate for veterans' issues, not because he'd changed his political beliefs, but because he'd learned to listen more carefully to the people he claimed to represent. "Today, as I accept this honor," Marcus continued, "I want to make a commitment to continue expanding our reach. The Rodriguez Martinez Foundation is launching a new initiative called Battle Buddies for Life, a program that pairs veterans struggling with survivor guilt with veterans who have successfully navigated that journey. We're also launching a scholarship program that will send the children of fallen soldiers to college, ensuring that their sacrifice continues to create opportunities for the next generation." The president stepped forward to present the medal, and as he placed it around Marcus's neck, he spoke quietly enough that only Marcus could hear. "Your country is proud of you, son. Rodriguez and Martinez would be proud too." After the ceremony, there was a reception in the East Room, where Marcus and Tommy had the opportunity to speak with many of the people whose lives had been touched by the Foundation's work. The stories they heard reinforced why their work mattered so much. Sarah Williams, a Marine Corps widow from North Carolina, approached them with her 2 young children. "Sergeant Johnson, Senator Tuberville, I wanted you to meet Emma and Jake. Their father, Sergeant First Class Robert Williams, was killed in Syria 3 years ago. Your Foundation's family support program helped us through the worst time of our lives. Emma starts college next fall on a Rodriguez Martinez Foundation scholarship." Emma, now 18 and headed to study social work, shook both men's hands. "I want to work with military families like my mom and me," she said. "Sergeant Johnson, your story helped me understand that my dad's death doesn't have to define my life. It can inspire it." Later, they met Captain Jennifer Chen, an Army psychiatrist who had implemented the Foundation's counseling protocols at Fort Bragg. "Your program has revolutionized how we approach survivor guilt and combat trauma," she told them. "We've seen a 60% reduction in suicide attempts among soldiers who participate in your support groups." As the evening progressed, Tommy and Marcus found themselves in a quiet corner of the reception, watching the crowd of people whose lives had been touched by their work. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't stopped outside your room that night?" Tommy asked. Marcus considered the question seriously. "I think about it sometimes. I was in a very dark place, Senator. If you hadn't listened, if you hadn't cared enough to come back the next day, I don't know if I would have found my way out of that darkness alone. But you did find your way out, and you brought a lot of other people with you." Marcus nodded, but his expression grew thoughtful. "You know what I've learned over this past year. Healing isn't something that happens to you. It's something you choose to do over and over again every day. And it's easier to choose healing when you're not doing it alone." "That's why the Foundation matters so much," Tommy agreed. "It's not just about providing services. It's about creating community, making sure no one has to face their worst moments alone." As they talked, a young soldier approached them hesitantly. He was clearly nervous, fidgeting with his uniform and looking uncertain about whether he should interrupt their conversation. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "Sergeant Johnson, I'm Private First Class David Park. I called your crisis hotline last month. I wanted to thank you." Marcus immediately gave the young soldier his full attention. "David, I'm so glad you called. How are you doing now?" "Better," David said, though his voice was still shaky. I lost my team leader in a training accident 6 months ago. I kept thinking it should have been me instead of him. I was planning to, well, you know. But when I called your hotline, the counselor told me about your story, about how you felt the same way I did. It helped me realize that maybe surviving doesn't make me a bad person. Tommy watched as Marcus embraced the young soldier, and he was struck by how natural this had become for Marcus, offering comfort, providing hope, being present for people in their darkest moments. "David," Marcus said, "surviving doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you responsible for living a life that honors your team leader's memory. Have you thought about how you want to do that?" "Actually, yes," David said, his voice growing stronger. "I want to become a counselor. Help other soldiers who are going through what I went through. I've already started taking psychology courses online." "That's exactly the kind of purpose that turns survival into something meaningful," Marcus told him. "Stay in touch with us, okay? The Foundation has scholarship programs for veterans pursuing careers in counseling and social work." As David walked away, clearly feeling better than when he'd approached them, Tommy realized that this was the real measure of their success. Not the awards or the media attention or the political recognition, but the individual lives that had been saved and transformed. "Marcus," Tommy said, "I need to tell you something. When I first heard you crying in that hospital room, I thought I was there to help you. But the truth is, you've changed my life just as much as I've changed yours. You've taught me what real leadership looks like. Not the kind that seeks credit or glory, but the kind that transforms pain into purpose." Marcus smiled, the same genuine smile that had first appeared when they decided to start the foundation together. "Senator, we helped each other, and now we're helping other people help each other. That's how healing works. It spreads from person to person, relationship to relationship, until whole communities are stronger." As the reception wound down and guests began to leave, Tommy and Marcus stood together in the now quiet East Room, surrounded by the portraits of previous presidents and the weight of American history. "What's next?" Tommy asked. "More of the same," Marcus replied. "More listening, more healing, more making sure that when soldiers like Rodriguez and Martinez give their lives for this country, their sacrifice creates something beautiful. We've proven that survivor guilt can be transformed into survivor purpose. Now we just keep doing the work." Tommy nodded, understanding that their partnership had evolved into something that would continue long after his Senate career ended, long after the media attention faded, long after the awards were forgotten. They had created something sustainable. Not just a foundation, but a movement that would ensure military families never had to face their darkest moments alone. As they walked out of the White House together, Tommy reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with a simple choice: to stop and listen when he heard someone in pain. That choice had led to friendship, partnership, and ultimately to a legacy that would help thousands of people find hope in their darkest hours. "You know," Tommy said as they stepped into the Washington evening, "I've been in politics for years, but this foundation, working with you, helping these families, this is the most important thing I've ever done." Marcus looked at his friend and mentor, the man who had literally saved his life by choosing to listen instead of walking away. "Senator, we're just getting started. Rodriguez and Martinez gave us a mission, and we're going to spend the rest of our lives making sure we're worthy of it." 6 months later, the Rodriguez-Martinez Foundation announced its most ambitious project yet: a national network of healing centers that would provide comprehensive support services for military families in every state. The funding had come from an unexpected source, a bipartisan congressional appropriation that Tommy had shepherded through the Senate, with support from both sides of the aisle. The foundation's success had become a rare example of what was possible when people chose cooperation over conflict, when they focused on solving problems rather than scoring political points. Military families didn't care about party politics. They cared about getting the help they needed to heal and rebuild their lives. At the groundbreaking ceremony for the first healing center in Birmingham, Alabama, Marcus stood before a crowd that included Gold Star families, veterans, active duty service members, and political leaders from both parties. But his remarks weren't about politics or fundraising. They were about the enduring power of human connection in the face of loss. When Senator Tuberville first heard me crying in that hospital hallway, Marcus said, he made a choice that changed both of our lives. He chose to listen instead of walking away. He chose to care instead of being convenient. He chose to act instead of just expressing sympathy. Tommy, now in his 70s but still energetic and committed to the foundation's work, stood nearby, proud of how far Marcus had come and grateful for the unexpected friendship that had grown from that first difficult conversation. Today, we're not just breaking ground on a building, Marcus continued. We're planting seeds that will grow into a network of support that will serve military families for generations. Every person who finds healing in these centers will honor the memory of every soldier who didn't make it home. That's how we transform sacrifice into service, loss into love, and grief into grace. The crowd erupted in applause, but Marcus held up his hand, indicating he wasn't finished. I want to end with something that Carlos Rodriguez used to say when our unit was facing difficult missions. He'd say, we don't get to choose what happens to us, but we get to choose what happens next. Rodriguez and Martinez didn't get to choose what happened to them on that road in Afghanistan. But Senator Tuberville and I, we got to choose what happened next. We chose to build something beautiful from something broken. We chose to create hope from despair. We chose to ensure that their sacrifice would save lives for years to come. As the ceremony concluded and people began to mingle, Tommy found himself approached by a reporter who had covered the foundation's story from the beginning. Senator Tuberville, the reporter asked, when you first heard Sergeant Johnson crying in that hospital, did you have any idea it would lead to all this? Tommy looked around at the crowd, veterans supporting each other, families finding community, young people inspired to serve others, and smiled. All I knew was that someone was in pain and needed to be heard, he said. Sometimes the most important moments in our lives start with the simplest choices. I chose to listen, and Marcus chose to trust me with his story. Everything else grew from that. The reporter pressed further. What's your advice for other people who might encounter someone in crisis? Tommy's answer was immediate and heartfelt. Don't walk away. Don't assume someone else will help. Don't worry about whether you have the right words or the perfect solution. Just be present. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply witness someone's pain and let them know they're not alone in it. As the sun set over Birmingham, casting long shadows across the construction site where the first Rodriguez-Martinez Healing Center would soon stand, Tommy and Marcus walked together toward their cars. Their conversation had evolved over the months from crisis management to strategic planning to genuine friendship, but the core remained the same. Two men committed to ensuring that military families never had to face their darkest moments alone. Marcus, Tommy said as they reached the parking area, I want you to know something. That night when I heard you crying, that was the most important night of my political career. Not because of what it led to, but because it reminded me why I wanted to serve in the first place, to help people, to make a difference in individual lives, not just policy debates. Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of what Tommy was saying. Senator, you didn't just help me that night. You showed me what leadership really looks like. It's not about having all the answers. It's about being willing to sit with people in their questions. It's not about being strong enough to carry everyone. It's about being brave enough to let people know they don't have to carry their burdens alone. As they shook hands goodbye, both men understood that their partnership had created something that would outlast both of their lives. The Rodriguez-Martinez Foundation would continue to grow, to evolve, to adapt to the changing needs of military families. But its core mission would remain constant, ensuring that no one had to face their worst moments alone and that every sacrifice made in service to the country would be honored through service to others. The story that had begun with a soldier's cry in a hospital hallway had become a national movement for healing and hope. It had shown that sometimes the most profound changes come not from grand gestures or political movements, but from individual acts of compassion that ripple outward to touch thousands of lives. Tommy Tuberville had heard a soldier crying, and what he did next had indeed shocked the entire country, not because it was dramatic or unprecedented, but because it was so fundamentally human. He had chosen to listen, to care, and to act. And that choice had created a legacy that would help military families heal for generations to come. In a world often divided by politics and ideology, the Rodriguez-Martinez Foundation stood as proof that healing was possible when people chose to focus on their shared humanity rather than their differences. It demonstrated that even the deepest wounds could become sources of strength when people were willing to support each other through the darkness toward the light. And it all started with one simple choice: to stop and listen when someone needed to be heard. Epilogue. 5 years later, the morning mist hung low over Arlington National Cemetery as Marcus Johnson walked slowly among the white headstones, carrying a small bouquet of yellow roses, Carlos Rodriguez's favorite flower. It had become his ritual every year on the anniversary of the explosion that had changed everything. Tommy Tuberville walked beside him, both men now older, their friendship deepened by years of shared purpose and mutual respect. They stopped at Section 60, where many of the fallen from Afghanistan and Iraq were laid to rest. Though Rodriguez and Martinez were buried in their home states, this section had become a place of pilgrimage for Marcus, a space where he could honor all the brothers and sisters who hadn't made it home. 5 years, Marcus said quietly, placing the roses at the base of a headstone. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, sometimes like a lifetime ago. Tommy nodded, understanding the strange way trauma warped time. How do you feel about everything we've built? Marcus was quiet for a moment, looking out over the endless rows of white markers. I feel like we kept our promise, not just to Rodriguez and Martinez, but to everyone who didn't make it home. Their sacrifice meant something because we made sure it meant something. The Rodriguez-Martinez Foundation had grown beyond either man's wildest dreams. What had started as a crisis intervention program had evolved into a comprehensive network of support services operating in all 50 states. They had prevented over 200 veteran suicides, helped more than 10,000 military families navigate loss and trauma, and trained thousands of counselors in military-specific mental health treatment. But perhaps most importantly, they had changed the national conversation about veteran mental health. Survivors' guilt was no longer a shameful secret that soldiers carried alone. It was a recognized condition with effective treatments and strong support systems. Maria called yesterday, Marcus said, referring to Carlos Rodriguez's widow. The scholarship program just sent its 100th student to college. Kids whose parents died in service, now becoming doctors, teachers, social workers. Carlos would have loved that. Tommy smiled, remembering the quiet strength of Maria Rodriguez and how her involvement had legitimized the foundation in ways that political endorsements never could. What about Rosa? She's opening her 3rd counseling practice next month, specializing in trauma therapy for military families. She told me she's naming it the Diego Martinez Center for Healing. Marcus's voice carried a note of pride. She said Diego always wanted to help people, and now he's helping them even after he's gone. They walked in comfortable silence for a while. Two men who had learned that grief shared was grief diminished, that purpose shared was purpose multiplied. Their partnership had evolved far beyond the crisis that had brought them together. Tommy had become like a father to Marcus, and Marcus had become the son Tommy had always hoped his own children might be. Dedicated to service, committed to something larger than himself. "I've been thinking about stepping back from the Senate," Tommy said suddenly. "After next term, maybe it's time to focus entirely on the foundation." Marcus looked surprised. "Senator, you don't have to do that. The foundation can succeed with you in the Senate. In fact, having you there helps us navigate federal funding and policy issues." "I know I don't have to," Tommy replied, "but I want to. This work, what we've built together, it's more important than any committee assignment or legislative victory. At my age, I want to spend my time on what matters most." They had reached the tomb of the unknown soldier, where the changing of the guard was taking place with its usual precision and solemnity. Both men stopped to watch, honoring the ritual that represented the nation's commitment to never forget those who had served. "You know what I realized," Marcus said as they watched the ceremony. "That night when you heard me crying, you probably saved my life. But I think maybe I saved yours too in a different way." Tommy looked puzzled. "How do you figure that? You were a successful coach, a successful politician, but you were searching for something more meaningful. Something that connected to your deepest values about service and sacrifice. The foundation gave you that. It gave you a legacy that goes beyond wins and losses, beyond election cycles and political battles." Tommy considered this, recognizing the truth in Marcus's words. His work with the foundation had indeed given him a sense of purpose that transcended politics. It had reminded him why he had entered public service in the first place, not for power or prestige, but to help people live better lives. "Maybe we saved each other," Tommy said finally. "You from despair, me from insignificance." As they left Arlington and drove back toward the city, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message. He read it and smiled broadly. "What is it?" Tommy asked. "Remember Private David Park, the kid who called our crisis hotline at the White House reception?" "Of course. The one who wanted to become a counselor. He just graduated with his master's degree in psychology. He starts work next week as a trauma counselor at Fort Campbell. Our scholarship program helped pay for his education." Tommy felt the familiar warmth that came with seeing their work create positive ripple effects in individual lives. That's the real measure of success, isn't it? Not the awards or the media attention, but the fact that David Park is going to help other soldiers who are where he used to be. Exactly, and he's not the only one. We've got former patients who are now counselors, Gold Star family members who have become advocates, veterans who went from contemplating suicide to saving other people's lives. Rodriguez and Martinez's sacrifice keeps multiplying, keeps saving lives years after they died. Dacula, they spent the rest of the drive talking about the Foundation's future plans, a new initiative to support military families dealing with invisible wounds like TBI and PTSD, a partnership with the Department of Defense to integrate their programs into basic training, teaching young soldiers about mental health before they ever deployed, a research program to study the long-term effectiveness of their interventions. But as they talked about expansion and new programs, both men understood that the Foundation's greatest strength would always be its commitment to individual relationships. Every person who called their crisis hotline would speak to someone who understood military culture. Every family that participated in their grief counseling would be matched with others who had walked the same difficult path. Every veteran dealing with survivors' guilt would be connected with someone who had successfully navigated that journey. "Marcus," Tommy said as they pulled into the Foundation's headquarters in downtown DC, "I need to tell you something." When I decided to run for Senate, I thought my legacy would be legislation I passed or committees I chaired. But the truth is, the Rodriguez-Martinez Foundation will outlast anything I ever did in politics. And it's a better legacy because it's not about me, it's about service to others. Marcus parked the car and turned to face his friend and mentor. Senator, this foundation exists because you made a choice to care about a stranger's pain. That choice created everything that followed. Rodriguez and Martinez gave their lives for their country, but you gave your time and energy to make sure their sacrifice had meaning. That's a legacy worth being proud of. As they walked into the building that housed the Foundation's national headquarters, they were greeted by a bustling scene of purposeful activity. Staff members were conducting training sessions for new counselors. Volunteers were organizing care packages for deployed troops. And in one corner, a group of Gold Star mothers were planning a memorial event for the upcoming holidays. This was what success looked like in their world. Not empty accolades or political victories, but a community of people who had transformed their pain into purpose, their loss into love, their grief into grace. It was a place where Carlos Rodriguez and Diego Martinez were remembered not just as casualties of war, but as the inspiration for a movement that had saved thousands of lives. Tommy and Marcus made their way to the memorial wall, where photos of fallen service members were displayed alongside stories of how the foundation had honored their memory. Each photo represented not just a life lost, but lives saved through the programs created in their honor. You know what I think Rodriguez would say if he could see all this? Marcus asked, looking at a photo of his fallen friend, smiling in his army dress uniform. What? He'd probably say, "Johnson, you finally figured out how to make something useful out of all that crying you did." Marcus smiled, remembering his friend's dry sense of humor. And then he'd ask if we were doing enough to take care of the families. "Are we?" Tommy asked seriously. Marcus looked around at the busy office, thought about the thousands of people they had helped, the hundreds of lives they had saved, the communities they had strengthened. "We're doing more than I ever dreamed possible. But there are still soldiers out there who are struggling, still families who are grieving alone, still people who need to know that their pain matters and their healing is possible. So no, we're never doing enough. That's what keeps us going." As the day ended and staff members began heading home to their families, Tommy and Marcus found themselves alone in the Foundation's conference room, looking out at the Washington skyline as the sun set behind the monuments that honored America's heroes. 5 years ago, I was a broken soldier who couldn't see past his own pain, Marcus reflected. Today, I'm sitting in the headquarters of an organization that has helped thousands of people heal. If that's not proof that redemption is possible, I don't know what is. Tommy nodded, thinking about his own journey from successful politician to meaningful servant. Marcus, I've learned something important from our partnership. The most significant moments in life often come disguised as ordinary choices. The choice to stop and listen. The choice to care about someone else's pain. The choice to act instead of just sympathizing. Those choices seem small at the time, but they can change everything. They can change everything, Marcus agreed. For the person making the choice and for the person receiving the care. That's what we've tried to build here. A place where those choices happen every day, where caring is systematic rather than accidental. As they prepared to leave, Marcus's phone buzzed with another message. This one was from a military spouse in Texas whose husband had been killed in action 6 months earlier. She had been participating in the Foundation's grief counseling program and wanted to share that she had finally been able to sleep through the night without nightmares. "Another life touched," Marcus said, showing Tommy the message. "Another family finding their way through the darkness. Another reason to keep doing the work," Tommy replied. They locked up the office together as they had done hundreds of times over the past 5 years. Outside, Washington, D.C. buzzed with its usual mixture of political ambition and tourist excitement, but Tommy and Marcus moved through it with the quiet satisfaction of people who had found their true calling. The Rodriguez-Martinez Foundation would continue to grow, to evolve, to adapt to the changing needs of military families. New leaders would emerge, new programs would be developed, new lives would be saved, but the heart of it would remain constant. The belief that every person's pain mattered, that healing was possible, and that no one should have to face their darkest moments alone. Tommy Tuberville had heard a soldier crying and had chosen to listen. That choice had created a legacy that would endure long after both men were gone, a testament to the power of compassion to transform individual pain into collective healing. As they walked their separate ways to their cars, both men carried with them the quiet satisfaction of a day well spent in service to others, and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to honor the memory of those who didn't make it home by caring for those who did.